there is still a significant coterie of people saying, finish the job. You've got a lot of individuals. You see a few of them here on the screen. You've got organizations like AEI, Foundation for Defensive Democracies. Yoav Gallant from Israel loves to finish the job. You see that common theme here, all these. And then there's major publications, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post. Yeah, man, let's go and finish the job. But as you said, President Trump hasn't done that so far, but these people keep pushing that direction. But there are three headwinds against that, and I'd like you to talk about each of these in order. Number one, we use so much ammunition in the first, and I'm talking about the key weapon systems of the JASSMs, long-range cruise missiles, Tomahawk cruise missiles, THAAD interceptors, and PAC-3 interceptors. So 2 offensive, 2 defensive. It's going to already take years to go through from what we've already done here. And then the other half of that equation is that Iran has regained access to most of its missile and underground sites. No matter what we did with using that much ammunition, it did not take them out, and they have already recovered. Why are people pushing so hard for something that self-evidently won't work?
On the first option, finish the job, the U.S. has made sort of intermediary moves, even in the last couple of days. These appear to have destroyed a Iranian radar facility on Surik Island. And those strikes against the islands in the Strait, the small islands, they seem to be, a prelude to a potential military attack, or maybe an occupation of one of these islands, or strategic pieces of land within the Strait. Who knows? But that does kind of make sense in that direction, although I just find it improbable that the U.S. would be able to do like a landing and hold territory, but still maybe they're just, jousting on that right now. So that's one thing. The other thing is, I think on the arms depletion, that's of course a very real situation, and the U.S. would need to buy time. So maybe the diplomatic shuffling back and forth and the head fakes and everything is just part of buying time. If Trump or Hegseth are hedging, believe they have enough in stock, if they can pull them from other locations and get them into position, that might take weeks or more, but that they would have enough for some kind of a grand fireworks show that might last a week or two, whereby they would call it mission accomplished, but it would be peace without peace. In other words, it would be like a standing order for a future conflict, whereby the United States could just prick Iran periodically and continue some of these games in the absence of a full-blown military attack again on Iran, not for a while, until they're able to execute some kind of a decisive blow against Iran. So we're caught in this kind of middle phase. I cannot see a negotiated settlement that's going to be binding. So we're kind of, U.S. is really stuck. They have to keep.
Yeah, aren't we also stuck from the fact? I mean, even if they are trying to, let's bide our time. I mean, you saw that thing. It could take years to get even the replacement. But then there's the issue of, okay, so you replace it all. Is a JASSM or a Tomahawk going to penetrate a mountain that it didn't penetrate the last time? I mean, what's the end state here? What's the objective?
Well, the objective is Karl Rove, history's actors. I mean, they could just destroy Iranian infrastructure, electrical grid, go back and redestroy South Park gas field and their petrochemical industrial complex, and say that, that's put them back another 5 years, and then just wait a year and then maybe do something again after a year. Who knows? But we all know that Iran's going to retaliate. So that's not really going to work either. So I honestly, for the longer Trump waits to respond militarily after all of these threats, then the political price just raises higher and higher at home, domestically, for the United States, and also internationally. The reputation suffers incrementally the longer he waits. So either, I don't want to use a derogatory term, but you either sort of do something, or get off of the pot, as it were. So, and he's caught in the middle. So, and Israel needs to buy time as well, because their defenses are clearly depleted. So this serves them. You notice the other thing is Israel's continuing to make incursions into Lebanon, and they're escalating now. And that's also part of any grand bargain, is what's happening in Lebanon. The U.S. and Israel want to separate that, But from the Iranian point of view, that's all part of the negotiations, or at least more broadly, that's part of the geopolitics.
Bottom line is there's not a viable alternative to go back. If you go back, because you didn't even talk about the fact that Iran, if we did any version of that, go back to fighting, that they're going to crush the whole energy infrastructure, or possibly desalinization plants, et cetera, in the Middle East, and just wreck the whole place, which would almost certainly send us into a global depression. So that also is a kind of a big headwind. But then the other headwind against going back and doing that, or maybe it's a tailwind in this case, is from Israel. So we're going to talk about several aspects of Israel and that Lebanon thing separately. But what about I just showed you a bunch of Americans that are trying to push this. What about the Israeli side, and why do they want Trump to go back to a kinetic operation that any rational assessment can say would not achieve the outcome we're looking for?
Israel views Iran as a threat, for sure. They maybe an existential threat. They view them as a political threat, definitely, because they support the Palestinian cause. They are championing the underdog, the Palestinian cause. But Israel's main concern, in terms of its priorities, is not Iran, because Iran's shown that they will cease hostilities. If nobody's firing at them, they will stop as well. So Iran's a rational actor internationally. Israel's not so concerned with them in that respect. What Israel's concerned with is its objectives in their immediate vicinity, and that is territory in South Lebanon, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, possibly beyond this, certainly in Syria as well. So about expanding their borders, this is an opportunity that Israel cannot pass up. They have made tremendous progress in expanding their borders and stealing territory from numerous neighboring Arab states. And so they believe that this is a golden opportunity historically for Israel to realize the dream of the Greater Israel Project, at least the first initial steps of it anyway. And so that's their concern. And so they're quite happy for the U.S. to do all the heavy lifting and to trade blows with Iran, be they diplomatically or militarily. And Israel's going to get busy over here with what it's doing with South Lebanon. And, Iran's clever, and they're a real geopolitical actor, because they have the leverage, they have the clout to pull the Lebanon issue into the negotiations. In other words, it's part of the quote deal, any deal that's going to happen. Why? Because Iran knows that Israel can use civilians in Lebanon. They know Iran cares about Palestinians and Lebanese and people in the region, and Israel can use that as leverage against Iran, or to stymie negotiations to spoil negotiations with the U.S. That's why they made that specific demand months ago, that there has to be a ceasefire in Lebanon, because Iran doesn't want to expose itself for Israel being able to use that in the three-way sort of dynamic between the U.S., Israel, and Iran when it comes to negotiations. Four-way if you count Lebanon. But Lebanon doesn't have any agency, as we can see at the moment, aside from what Hezbollah is doing in South Lebanon to defend that territory. So it's very clever that Iran is not letting that go and allowing that to be a separate item, because by doing that, it's weakening the things that it's trying to negotiate elsewhere.
And let's take a look at that. If Israel is providing a tailwind to want to go back into a foolish decision to go back to war, they're providing a headwinds toward the second one, which is a negotiated settlement. Now, I've heard from a lot of folks, and we've had some on this show, that say the biggest fear that Israel actually has is that Trump will give in to the quote pressure and have a negotiated settlement of any kind to get this over with. And as you mentioned, one of the biggest issues, maybe the biggest issue in there, is the Lebanese issue. Now, here's what Netanyahu said just this morning on that topic.
There will not be a situation where Hezbollah attacks our cities and our citizens, and its terror headquarters in Beirut and the Dahiyya remain out of bounds.
So, man, you just listen to that, especially as a Western audience, is like, well, yeah. I mean, man, if these terrorists are attacking Israel down there for crying out loud, of course, they have every right to defend themselves. So how dare you suggest otherwise? Oh, wait a minute. Let's look at the news. Israel invaded Lebanon, opening a new front against Iran. And that's back on March 16th in this particular iteration of it here. So you can't invade a country and then say, okay, well, they fought back. And so how dare they? And so that's why we have to keep going on, because you have this, really this circular illogic, if you will. But now for those who may not know, some people, even those who watch the show, may think that, okay, well, Hezbollah has been a kind of a proxy for Iran, so I can see why they would care a little bit. But I want to show you what Nima Al-Horshid said on our show, because it's not just kind of important, it is centrally important to Iran.
The other 2 points which are so important on the part of Iranian is the immediate release of $12 billion in frozen Iranian assets, that it's going to be part of the deal. When they announce this, the signing of this document, the two sides will announce that they have signed the document. There has to be an immediate release of this $12 billion of Iranian frozen assets. And the second point, which is so important in my opinion, which is the most important point in the whole memorandum of understanding, is the ceasefire in Lebanon. There is no way that Iran would accept, without any sort of deal, any sort of agreement with the United States, and without having a ceasefire in Lebanon. These are huge issues, Colonel. I don't know if the United States is going to be some sort of leverage to put pressure on Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel to do such a thing.
So the solution, let me ask you, I mean, we could talk about all kinds of deals, this memorandum of understanding and opening the strait and the two blockades opening up, and we could talk about a lot of those, and those are important. But if you don't get past this Lebanese issue, then none of the other stuff even gets brought up to the table. So why do you suppose, or better question is, on the surface of it, it looks like that Israel has a veto over any negotiations at all, by saying we'll just keep accelerating and escalating in Lebanon, no matter what President Trump says. So is Israel really driving the train here?
Yeah, they are. And that's very well put, Daniel. They do have that kind of veto over negotiations, so long as Lebanon's included in that package. And but over time, if Iran sticks to its guns and doesn't give any leeway on that, eventually that pulls Israel into the blame game. So people then can blame people who want to see peace, who want to see stability in the region, will be able to blame on Israel. That's what's eventually going to happen if it hasn't already begun already. So what Israel's doing is playing basically a deception game, saying that Hezbollah is attacking, they're terrorizing Israelis. They're only hitting military targets. Israel, on the other hand, is killing thousands of Lebanese civilians, and they're threatening mass annihilation and giving evacuation orders to, like the third largest city in in Lebanon, the city of Tyre, the historic city of Tyre, giving evacuation orders, saying you got to clear out, and we're going to level the place. I mean, again, we're back to the genocide narrative. It's exactly the tactics they use in Gaza. So this is one of the problems with this conversation. And of course, I have to be very careful how I frame it because of the legal proscriptions of Hezbollah as a quote as a terrorist group, according to Western governments and Israel. Because that's part of the problem in this conversation. Because if you show any recognition that Hezbollah is an example, which is based in South Lebanon, they are from South Lebanon, that they are fighting an anti-occupation liberation struggle against an invading enemy, then you can fall foul of censorship laws or terrorism laws, and etc. That's one of the problems. And Israel doesn't have to abide by any of these sort of guardrails in terms of the conversation, but anybody else does. But it's kind of glaringly obvious how lopsided the situation is in Lebanon. But Israel continues to get away with it because they have the wind at their back in terms of the war of, speech control because of the terrorism designation of Hezbollah. So that's a big part of the problem, and it means that there's going to be no negotiations, or there's going to be no kind of dialogue between the sovereign elements in Lebanon and everybody else. And Netanyahu's lying, saying that Hezbollah is terrorizing Israelis, because they're not. They're engaged in a very strict military battle with military targets. Israel, on the other hand, is engaged in actual terrorism. They're killing civilians en masse and threatening to level cities. I mean, that's about as terroristic as you can possibly get.
Yeah, I know. You have that issue of the designations. For those who may not be clear on this, I wonder if you could just real quick, kind of a side diversion here. The claim is always, Hezbollah is a proxy of Iran, like Iran started all these proxies to go after Israel, etc. But as far as you understand, what is the actual origin of Hezbollah? How did they create? What caused them to be created in the first place, or them to rise up?
Well, I'm being historical fact. Hezbollah didn't exist and wouldn't exist if not for Israel's occupation of South Lebanon for 2 decades, for 20 years, the 1980s and 1990s, let's say. Okay, the Hezbollah was created and founded and born out of that situation, because what Israel did was they had this. They deputized this sort of trustee force, Israeli proxy force, this South Lebanese security force, the South Lebanese army, and used that to basically brutalize the local population during the 80s and 90s. And Hezbollah was fighting against that. So, and they came formally into existence, formally in 1985, long after the Beirut Marine barracks bombing. But the one thing the U.S. always cite that is like Hezbollah's killing Americans is the Beirut Marine barracks bombing. Well, there's a number of other explanations and actors that would have an interest, including Israel itself, but that's a separate argument, to see the United States out of Lebanon in 1982, in 1983. So that's a separate conversation. But they exist. There would be no Hezbollah if not for Israel occupying South Lebanon. You could probably make the same technical argument with regards to Hamas. In Gaza, there would be no Hamas if there wasn't the brutal occupation and all the sort of periodic culling, or what Israelis call mowing the lawn in Gaza. There would be no Hamas. I mean, they wouldn't exist. So that's the problem with this conversation. We really can't have an objective argument and analysis because it's so heavily loaded. When you slap that terrorism label on, basically cannot have an objective analytical conversation. Quite frankly, it makes it very difficult to get closer to any kind of meaningful negotiated settlement because you're dealing with the indigenous population.
Yeah,
but,
and so
it's hard. It's very hard.
Let's look at that part of that same equation here. Okay, make sure I'm still in there. This is the Israeli news today. Lebanon truce unravels as Netanyahu casts instruct IDF to renew Hezbollah strikes in Beirut. Gary was just showing you a headline there of people trying to flee Beirut right now in anticipation of what may come. But let's look at what has been the reaction of it here. This is also this morning. You see, that's June 1st, early this morning, our time. Galibaf, the speaker of the Iranian parliament and their chief negotiator, says the naval blockade and escalation of war crimes in Lebanon by the Zionist regime are clear evidence of U.S. noncompliance with the ceasefire. Every choice has a price, and the bill comes due. It will all fall into place. That was echoed and expanded a little bit by Abbas Araghchi, the Iranian foreign minister, who says, for urgent attention, a ceasefire between Iran and the United States constitutes, without any ambiguity, a comprehensive ceasefire across all fronts, specifically, he says, including Lebanon. Any violation of this ceasefire on one side shall be considered a violation across all its fronts. The United States and Israel bear responsibility for the consequences of any breach of the truth. So, I mean, let me ask you, I mean, you have Iranian sources too. That's a pretty strong statement there. And that echoes something that we showed last week, toward the end of last week, where Moshe Rezaei, I think is his name, was the senior military advisor to the supreme leader, who said, listen, if this blockade doesn't lift, we may unblock it with military means. Do you see any possibility that these negotiations at all could disintegrate because of the Lebanon issue, and that it could be Iran who restarts something? What do you think they mean by those things?
Well, that's possible. It's possible, but at the very least, even if Iran doesn't start sort of its own kind of wave of military hostilities, even if they don't, the U.S. and Israel are trying to basically operate in Lebanon and in occupied Syria as if it's a separate situation, and they've been able to get away with that in the press. But what Iran has done is, by casting a wider net, Iran is expanding the you could call it the zone of concern that's tied to an overall settlement, and it's very similar to how Iran has made the Gulf states part of this conflict because they're hosting U.S. bases. When you look at the U.S. media, and they don't really want to include the Gulf states as sort of co-belligerents, let's say, for hosting U.S. Military facilities. So they're very keen in the West, and on the other side, this argument to separate all of these things, to compartmentalize it. Very cleverly, Iran is trying to approach this holistically, and it's going to work. I'm telling you, it worked with the Gulf, and it's changed the behavior of the Gulf states. And if they stick to their guns, it's going to work here. Eventually, the international community, it might take a while, but the international community and the Europeans and other Western actors will start to look at Israel as the main obstacle to any de-escalation negotiated settlement. And Iran knows that. And I think that's why they're playing a long game here. The U.S. is playing this terminal short game on everything, just constant managing of tactics, where Iran's much clearer. They have a long-term strategy. They've incorporated that into their demands and how they're negotiating this. And I think the U.S. is having a big problem with that. They're really struggling. And Israel's just going to continue to try to achieve its military objectives in their near neighborhood.